Okay, so today's Ukraine explainer is going to talk about the fact that we're now 100 days into this war. 100 days. I'm not sure anybody really expected that when we began, but we're 100 days, and I have to say I'll be pretty surprised if we end this in less than 200 days. And in fact, I think we'll probably get closer to 500 days or maybe a lot more than that before this ends. But there are some things to talk about that have been happening currently, so an update, but also because we are at this sort of random 100-day mark, talk a little bit about where it looks like things might be headed. A lot has changed, of course, since February 24th. So the big battle over the last few weeks has been in Donetsk Oblast, in Luhansk Oblast, around the city of Severodonetsk. This is on the eastern bank of the Seversky Donetsk River. It's really the last city that Ukraine holds on the east side of that river. And if Russia can take that, and it looks like they're going to take it sometime in the next few days, if they can take that city, it is a necessary point on the way to taking over the rest of Luhansk Oblast, which, as Putin stated, way back on February 21st, in announcing Russia's support for these breakaway republics, that's clearly one of the Russian war aims. So, not significant in any gigantic sense, other than that if you want to take over Luhansk Oblast, you have to take over this city. This battle has demonstrated or been an example of what we might call new Russian tactics, but actually they're very old Russian tactics. They're new Russian tactics in the context of this war, right? Russia, when in the Battle of Kiev, Russia tried to bring in mobile armor and air mobile forces, and it just didn't work very well. What Russia is doing now around Severodonetsk is older Russian tactics, the tactics we saw Russia use to take the city of Grozny in Chechnya in 2000, and frankly, the tactics they used to take places like Berlin in 1940s, which is you line up massive, massive numbers of artillery tubes and rocket launchers, and you just blast a position or a city in particular. You just blast it into oblivion. Then you move in artillery. Then you move in armor and infantry, and take whatever you can take. And then when you've gone as far as you can go, you stop and you bombard again. This is very effective because if you dump enough artillery shells onto a place, it becomes very hard to stay there and defend it. It's a very slow way to take territory, and it is immensely destructive. Not only in human life, but it means that the city you take over essentially is a city of rubble. That has worked for the Russians in the past, and they seem to be quite willing to do that now. It's slow but effective. This, incidentally, is why Ukraine has been asking for longer range artillery systems from the West, so that it can have the means necessary to try to better combat those Russian artillery systems. It's also the case that while Russia looks like it might be short of various things like tanks and perhaps fighter aircraft and maybe even soldiers, it is not short of artillery or of artillery shells. And so this tactic really plays to Russia's advantage and to Ukraine's disadvantage, because they don't necessarily have the same amount of artillery, and supplying the shells needed to be firing and firing and firing is a real difficult task for Ukraine. So tactically, this is a success in the sense that slowly but surely Russia is taking Severodonetsk. Is it a strategic success? Well, I think it's too early to say, and it's more questionable. And of course, it depends on the strategy of the goal in the goals. If the goal simply is to take territory very slowly and incrementally, well, yeah, it's doing that. The question is this a formula that will take Russia from a local tactical victory to a big strategic victory in the war? And I think that's more questionable. The United States military released an assessment earlier this week, basically saying Russia's making the same kind of mistakes that it's been making all along, which is local commanders don't have enough authority to be able to really adjust to the situation. and that while Russia is taking territory, it's losing so many soldiers that it's fairly quickly wearing down its ability to continue to fight. I think that is one of the big questions. I'm not quite so ready to be as optimistic as this assessment was. Clearly, this form of fighting, any fighting where you're trying to take control of cities by fighting through them, is going to get a lot of people killed. A big question is it getting how fast is it getting Russian soldiers killed compared to Ukrainian soldiers killed? Who can keep this up the longest? If this kind of warfare continues, right? Who can sustain it the longest? In terms of artillery and artillery shells, I think the Russians have good reason to be confident. If it comes down to manpower, maybe not so much. So this kind of is where we are. And this is, of course, a very dramatic difference from where we were, at the beginning of this war, where things looked like they were going to go very quickly. It looked like it was going to be a mobile war. We thought maybe a few days, it's over. This kind of war that Russia is fighting now is a war that, even if it goes successfully for Russia, could take months or years to gain the territory they're trying to gain. So, to stress a point I've made before, I talked before about moving from a sprint to a marathon. Well, this war's a marathon now. In a lot of respects, this is a war now that's about attrition of men and material and about who can resupply best and fastest. Right now, the resupply is about artillery shells and artillery pieces, but it could shift into something else. What this means, and this is as we get to sort of the big picture strategy looking forward to the next 100 days or a couple of 100 days, one of the key limiting factors or enabling factors on Ukraine's ability to resist now is Western supplies. This big debate has been over exactly what kind of artillery systems and rocket systems, what are called multiple rocket launch systems, the United States was going to give Ukraine. The United States sort of trying to, I think in a way that's almost ridiculous, trying to calibrate, right? Give Ukraine enough weapons to stop the Russian advance, but not enough to do too much, right? With this idea that, well, if we give them too much help, it might provoke Putin to do something worse. And while there's no doubt that that's a real worry, it's put the United States and the West more generally in this situation of you're trying to help the Ukrainians win the war, but not too much. And I don't think it's a really tenable position to be in particular, because whether anybody really wants to admit it right now, through the arming decisions that the West is making, the West is now essentially shaping how this war is going to go, and in particular, shaping down the road the extent to which Ukraine can or cannot push Russian troops back, and therefore really what the conditions for peace at some point will be. It's important to note as well that while Russia is doing as much as it can on the battlefield in places like Severodonetsk, but also elsewhere, they're still fighting up around Kharkiv, and there's more fighting down around Kherson and so on. There's another kind of escalation Russia can do, and I'm not talking about nuclear escalation, which I still think is incredibly small. But, if you look at pictures of video of what's going on in Kiev, and one of my friends, sent me some video of him being out in Kiev this past weekend when, it's this sort of traditional spring holiday in Kiev and everybody is out walking around. Well, there were still sandbags around the important monuments and so on, but the people of Kiev were out enjoying a beautiful spring day. The Russians are not indiscriminately bombing or sending missiles in or rockets into major Ukrainian cities like Kiev or Lviv. So it is the case that to the extent that Ukraine begins to make some real gains on the battlefield, if that were to happen, there is this other kind of escalation Russia can do. And we simply don't know if and when they would do that or what the consequences would be. So this brings us to a big debate that's now brewing over what's the path to peace. And it gets this kind of, I think, illogical situation that the West is now in, which is the United States, the West is supplying Ukraine, but at the same time is trying to keep Ukraine from getting powerful enough to do something that Russia really doesn't like. And so you're trying to win a war, but not win it too much, which is very strange. So Henry Kissinger was in Davos last week, the big billionaire conference in Davos. Kissinger is not a billionaire, but he's somebody that billionaires apparently listen to. And he was basically saying Ukraine's going to have to give away some territory to end this war. And people were outraged. And I understand why people are outraged, but at the same time, he really wasn't saying too much that President Zelensky hadn't said earlier in the war when things were going really badly, which is we want to get the Russians back to where they were on February 24th. It's not necessarily saying we're going to push them all the way back out of the territory they took in 2014, either in eastern Ukraine or even more ambitiously in Crimea. So we're in this weird situation where, on the one hand, you think, well, the way to get Russia to stop is to begin to defeat its troops on the battlefield. And that makes perfect sense. The only way they're going to stop is if stopping becomes in their interest. In other words, they're losing the war. But at the same time, there's this fear that we don't want them to lose the war too much, because if they do, they might escalate. So in this perspective, is sort of saying, well, you need to get the Ukrainians maybe to admit that they're going to have to make some concessions. The Ukrainians say, well, if we make concessions, then the Russians are going to keep on asking for more. And there's real logic in that as well. The reality is we don't know what Russia will accept or what it won't accept. We know very little about Russia's war aims at their most ambitious, or about what they might settle for and how they might respond to different costs. What we do know is that there is still this potential for Russia to escalate. And so the difficult thing for the Western Ukraine now is to sort of calibrate how do you try to push Russia to negotiate a peace that Ukraine and the West think they can live with, knowing that there is always sort of this escalation that Russia can bring to the table if it chooses to. And again, I'm not even talking about nuclear escalation. I'm just talking about indiscriminate bombing of Ukrainian civilian populations. So it's a pretty tough strategic situation. And this is my opinion, at least in public, in the things that leaders have said. And Biden published an op-ed piece in the New York Times today. It's not clear to me that, at least in what's being said publicly, that Western leaders have sort of come to grips with the paradoxical situation in they're in, and the hard choices they have to make. And the hard choices is you're either going to have to really try to push Russia back and take the risk of escalation, or you're going to have to concede a whole bunch of Ukrainian territory and deal with the risk that Ukraine decides, well, okay, as long as you're willing to give stuff away, we're going to take more of it. And when we're done with Ukraine, well, maybe we'll have a good hard look at Poland and some other countries as well. That's really still where we are at this point. And so, again, to look at the big picture, it's not only that we're in the early phases of this war on the ground, potentially, but we're in the early phases of the war in that certainly the West is just beginning to come to grips with what kinds of things might constitute success, what kind of things might constitute a strategy to get to success. And for all we know, Russia and the Russian leadership is still coming to grips with that as well. And in that sense, what some would argue, and I think there's some reason to say this, is that the route to peace is neither through big concessions to Russia, nor through taking a bunch of territory back from Russia, but sometimes the route to peace is through a deadlock. And of course, any deadlock could potentially last for years and could leave Russia in control of a lot of Ukrainian territory. So there's a lot that we still have yet to find out. And from that perspective, I'm not sure there's any reason to be as optimistic after 100 days as we were after a couple of weeks. After a couple of weeks, it looks, oh, Russia's losing. Well, it's 100 days on and Russia's not winning, but neither is anybody else. Famous political scientists once said, asking who won a war is like asking who won the San Francisco earthquake. That is to say, nobody wins these things. And at least so far, there's a lot of people getting killed, a lot of harm being done, nobody really winning. We'll see what happens in the next 100 days and beyond.